In March 2009, the coastal city of Corpus Christi, Texas, became the scene of one of the most tragic police chases in state history. 27-year-old Daniel Lee Lopez, a troubled man with a violent past, made a decision that would end not only another man's life, but ultimately his own. It began like any other night on patrol for Lieutenant Stuart Alexander, a respected officer with nearly 2 decades of service. When Lopez sped away from a routine traffic stop, the chase that followed would stretch across dark Texas highways, a blur of flashing lights, roaring engines, and panic. Moments later, as officers deployed spike strips to stop the SUV, Lieutenant Alexander stepped forward to do his duty. But Lopez didn't stop. He barreled through the barricade, striking the officer head-on. Lieutenant Alexander was killed instantly. The city of Corpus Christi was left in shock. A veteran cop was gone, and the man responsible showed no signs of fighting his fate. Instead, Daniel Lopez did something almost no death row inmate ever does. He asked to be executed. Diagnosed with mental illness, burdened by guilt, and tired of living in a cage, Lopez refused to appeal his death sentence. He told the courts, "I accept my punishment." His final days were filled not with defiance, but with resignation. And when the state of Texas granted his wish, Lopez faced the end with calm acceptance, leaving behind a haunting question. Did justice serve its purpose, or did the system help a man take his own life? To understand how a reckless chase turned deadly, how a police hero lost his life, and how a convicted killer walked willingly to the death chamber, we have to go back to the beginning. But first, hit subscribe, tap the notification bell, and join us as we uncover the true story of Daniel Lee Lopez, the man who asked to die. Born and raised in the coastal city of Corpus Christi, Texas, Daniel Lee Lopez grew up in an environment defined by struggle, poverty, and turbulence. According to public records and later court documents, Lopez's early life was far from stable, marked by family conflict, neglect, and brushes with the law that began before he was old enough to fully understand the weight of his actions. Teachers described him as a quiet but volatile child, one who could go from withdrawn to explosive in moments. Neighbors recalled a boy who seemed constantly in motion, running the streets, skipping school, hanging around older kids already deep into drugs and petty crime. By his teenage years, Daniel was already slipping through the cracks. Juvenile arrests began to stack up, fights, vandalism, theft, each one pushing him further from the chance of a normal life. The probation reports from that period paint a bleak picture, a young man bouncing in and out of detention centers, often uncooperative, distrustful of authority, and surrounded by the same troubled influences that kept pulling him back in. By his early 20s, Lopez had built a reputation among local law enforcement. Police knew his name, his car, his record. He had been arrested multiple times for assault, for drug possession, for resisting arrest. But the most serious charge came when he was convicted of indecency with a child, a crime that forced him to register as a sex offender, a label that would follow him everywhere he went and make finding work or rebuilding a future nearly impossible. Those close to him say that conviction changed him, not for the better, but for the worse. He grew angry, reckless, and unpredictable. He began drinking heavily, getting into fights, and driving aimlessly through Corpus Christi's night streets. Friends who once tried to help him said it was like watching someone slowly destroy themselves. Police reports from that time describe him as aggressive, impulsive, and prone to violence, a man with no patience, no stability, and seemingly no plan for his life. Psychological evaluations later revealed that Lopez struggled with deep-rooted mental health issues, including depression and antisocial traits. He had difficulty controlling his emotions and often acted without thinking, a dangerous mix when combined with his growing resentment toward the world and a feeling that he had nothing left to lose. As one officer later described, Daniel Lopez wasn't evil. He was broken, angry, and tired of being told no. By 2009, Daniel Lee Lopez had become a man at war with himself, restless, defiant, and unpredictable. The courts saw him as a repeat offender. His community saw him as a lost cause. And though he had spent most of his life running from consequences, the choices he would make that March evening would ensure that the running would finally stop, in the most tragic way possible. Lieutenant Stuart Alexander was the kind of police officer every department hopes for: steady, disciplined, and deeply respected by those who served beside him. At 47 years old, he had spent nearly 2 decades with the Corpus Christi Police Department, rising through the ranks not through ambition or politics, but through sheer dedication and courage. Colleagues described him as the definition of a professional: calm under pressure, compassionate with victims, and unflinchingly brave when danger called. He wasn't a man who chased recognition. He simply believed in doing what was right every single day. Outside the badge, Stuart was a husband, a father, and a friend. Those who knew him say he had a quiet sense of humor, a love for family gatherings, and a deep affection for his hometown. He mentored younger officers, teaching them not just how to enforce the law, but how to serve with empathy and restraint. To his children, he was a hero, not because he wore a gun or a badge, but because he always came home, always made time, and always kept his promises. By early 2009, Lieutenant Alexander was one of the most trusted field supervisors in the department. Known for leading from the front, he often volunteered for the hardest assignments, not out of pride, but out of duty. He wouldn't ask anyone to do something he wouldn't do himself, one fellow officer recalled. It was that sense of responsibility that placed him on the roadside that fateful March night, performing a routine yet dangerous task to protect others. On March 11th, 2009, Lieutenant Alexander responded to reports of a high-speed pursuit racing through the city. It wasn't the first time he had faced danger, but every chase carried its own risks. The call came through his radio: a fleeing suspect in a dark SUV, refusing to stop. Acting quickly, he moved to intercept the route, coordinating with other officers to deploy spike strips near an exit ramp. He positioned himself in a turnout along the highway, crouched low, doing what he had done countless times before, protecting his fellow officers, his community, and everyone else who might be in harm's way. He had no idea that this would be his final call. In the seconds that followed, as the roar of an engine grew louder, everything changed. Daniel Lee Lopez's speeding SUV came into view, barreling toward him at full force. There was no time to move, no chance to react. The impact was devastating, sudden, violent, and final. Lieutenant Alexander died, doing what he had devoted his life to: serving and protecting the people of Corpus Christi. His death sent shockwaves through the community, a tragic reminder of how fragile the line between order and chaos can be. For his fellow officers, it wasn't just the loss of a colleague, it was the loss of a brother. For his family, it was the unthinkable: a home forever silenced by the absence of a man who had dedicated his entire life to keeping others safe. It began like so many other encounters between police and suspect, with a routine traffic stop. On the evening of March 11th, 2009, officers in Corpus Christi spotted a dark SUV being driven erratically through the city's south side. When they signaled for the driver to pull over, the man behind the wheel, Daniel Lee Lopez, chose not to comply. Instead, with a single, reckless decision, he slammed his foot on the gas and tore off into the night. What followed was pure chaos. Officers described the chase as one of the most dangerous they had ever experienced: a desperate race through residential streets, intersections, and open highways, often exceeding 100 miles per hour. Witnesses later told investigators they saw the SUV blowing through stop signs and red lights, narrowly missing other vehicles as it careened toward the outskirts of town. The driver seemed determined not to stop, no matter who got in his way. As patrol cars fell into formation behind him, dispatchers scrambled to coordinate containment. Officers set up roadblocks and prepared spike strips along potential exit routes, hoping to end the chase before it claimed any lives. Among those responding was Lieutenant Stuart Alexander, a veteran supervisor with years of experience in vehicle pursuits. He took position near an industrial stretch of road outside the city limits, where Lopez's SUV was expected to pass. It was a dark, moonless night, and the only light came from the revolving strobes of squad cars and the faint glow of the city in the distance. Alexander's task was simple but deadly: deploy the spike strips, disable the vehicle, and bring the chase to an end. At 10:30 p.m., the pursuit came into view, headlights blinding, tires screeching, engines screaming through the dark. Officers shouted warnings over the radio. "He's coming fast. He's not slowing down." But Lopez didn't brake. Witnesses said the SUV swerved violently, fishtailing across lanes before veering directly toward Lieutenant Alexander's position. Sound design. The noise peaks, a deafening roar, the screech of rubber on asphalt. Then the sound cuts to absolute silence. In a single, irreversible instant, tragedy struck. The impact was catastrophic. Lieutenant Stuart Alexander was hit head-on, thrown by the force of the collision, and killed instantly. His fellow officers rushed to his aid, but there was nothing they could do. The chase, which had begun as a routine stop, was over, but its cost was immeasurable. The night that began with flashing lights and adrenaline ended with grief, disbelief, and the haunting realization that a dedicated officer had died in the line of duty, and that the man responsible was already in handcuffs, muttering words no one could understand. As dawn broke over Corpus Christi, the crash site became a somber landmark, a place where fellow officers placed flowers and whispered prayers. For the department, it was the darkest night in years. For the city, it was a tragedy that would not soon be forgotten. And for Daniel Lee Lopez, it was the moment that sealed his fate, the act that would send him to a courtroom, a death sentence, and, eventually, the execution chamber in Huntsville. Within moments of the collision, Daniel Lee Lopez was pulled from his damaged vehicle and forced to the ground by officers who had just watched their colleague, their leader, lose his life before their eyes. He was bleeding, dazed, and mumbling incoherently, but there was no resistance. The manhunt was over, and the suspect who had turned a city street into a deadly racetrack now lay handcuffed beside the road. As medics pronounced Lieutenant Stuart Alexander dead at the scene, the realization rippled through the police force. One of their most respected veterans had been killed in the line of duty. For the Corpus Christi Police Department, grief quickly turned into resolve. Detectives worked through the night, documenting every piece of evidence. Lopez's SUV was impounded and tested, while officers provided detailed statements recounting every second of the chase. When investigators pieced together the events, one charge became undeniable: capital murder of a peace officer, the gravest offense in Texas law. Prosecutors alleged that Lopez had not merely fled from police. He had turned his vehicle into a weapon, deliberately steering it toward Lieutenant Alexander in a reckless act of aggression. Under Texas statute, intentionally killing a law enforcement officer while performing his duty is punishable by death. The legal battle that followed gripped the city of Corpus Christi. During Lopez's trial in Nueces County, prosecutors painted a portrait of a man who had spent years defying the law. A convicted felon, a registered sex offender, and a habitual criminal who showed no regard for authority or human life. They played dashcam footage, replayed radio calls, and displayed photographs from the crash site, arguing that Lopez's deliberate choice to accelerate toward the lieutenant proved intent. He used that SUV, one prosecutor said, as his weapon of murder. But Lopez's defense team countered that narrative. They claimed that what happened that night was not premeditated murder. It was panic. They argued that Daniel had lost control of his vehicle while desperately trying to flee arrest, consumed by fear and confusion. His attorney told the jury that Lopez never set out to kill anyone, and that his actions were the reckless reflexes of a man terrified of returning to prison. Still, the evidence against him was overwhelming. Eyewitness testimony, vehicle data, and forensic analysis all pointed to the same conclusion. Lopez's SUV never showed signs of braking. The steering pattern suggested a direct and intentional veer toward Lieutenant Alexander's position. To the jury, that was more than panic, it was purpose. By the time the verdict was announced, the courtroom was silent. The jury found Daniel Lee Lopez guilty of capital murder. The penalty phase was swift. The same panel that convicted him voted unanimously for the death sentence. For the Alexander family and the Corpus Christi Police Department, justice had been served in the eyes of the law. For Lopez, his path from the streets of his youth to the death row of Texas was now sealed by a single decision. One reckless night that could never be undone. Outside the courthouse, reporters captured the raw emotion. Officers hugging one another, the victim's family holding photos of Stuart Alexander, and a community torn between relief and sorrow. The man who once ran from police would now spend his final years in a maximum security cell, waiting for the state of Texas to carry out its ultimate punishment. 33:00, 41:00, life on death row. After his conviction for the capital murder of Lieutenant Stuart Alexander, Daniel Lee Lopez was transferred to Texas death row, located inside the Huntsville Unit, a place where time stands still. Designed for maximum security, Huntsville is where condemned inmates spend up to 23 hours a day alone in their cells, waiting for a date that could come years, even decades, later. But Lopez was different. From the very start, he made it clear he didn't want to wait. While most death row inmates spend years fighting for their lives through endless appeals and last-minute petitions, Lopez began filing motions of a very different kind. In letters to judges and legal representatives, he repeatedly asked the court to waive his right to appeal and expedite his execution. "I take full responsibility for what I did," one document read. "I'm ready to die." These words shocked both his lawyers and the public. It was an almost unheard-of request in the American death penalty system, a condemned man volunteering for his own death. His attorneys, deeply alarmed, argued that Lopez was not mentally stable enough to make such a decision. They cited his history of trauma, substance abuse, and self-destructive behavior as signs that his desire to die stemmed from mental illness, not true remorse. They described him as a man consumed by guilt, shame, and hopelessness, one who saw death as his only escape from the life he had destroyed and the pain he had caused. But despite their pleas, the courts disagreed. Psychiatrists evaluated Lopez multiple times and declared him legally competent to make his own choices. In the eyes of the law, Daniel Lopez understood the consequences of his decision, and he accepted them. Over the years, Lopez's resolve never wavered. Each time an appeal was automatically filed on his behalf, as required by Texas law, he responded by asking for it to be withdrawn. He told one court, "I don't want to waste the state's time. I just want to take responsibility and get this over with." His case became one of the rare examples of an inmate not fighting the system, but urging it to carry out his sentence. As the years passed, Lopez became known among prison staff as polite, withdrawn, and eerily calm. He didn't cause trouble, didn't speak much, and often kept to himself. Guards described him as a man who had already made peace with his fate, a prisoner counting down to the inevitable. Unlike others who clung to hope, Lopez seemed to embrace the end as a form of atonement. By 2015, after 6 years of confinement and multiple judicial reviews, the Texas Court of Criminal Appeals finally granted his wish. Daniel Lee Lopez's execution date was set for August 12, 2015. His reaction was not fear or anger. It was acceptance. He told reporters through a written statement, "I accept my fate." In a system where most inmates fight for more time, Lopez did the opposite. He surrendered it. And as the day of his execution approached, many wondered, was this true accountability or state-assisted suicide? Either way, his decision would set him apart from nearly every other man who ever walked death row in Texas. On August 12, 2015, after years of waiting for a fate he had chosen, Daniel Lee Lopez was transported from the Huntsville Unit to the Huntsville State Penitentiary, known to most as simply the Walls Unit. It is here, inside this quiet facility in the heart of Texas, that the state carries out its executions. For Lopez, it would be the end of a long road and the closing chapter of a life defined by chaos, guilt, and surrender. That evening, as the clock crept towards 6 p.m., prison officials followed the standard routine that had been repeated hundreds of times before. Lopez was offered the opportunity to choose his final meal, one last act of individuality before death. But In keeping with his quiet acceptance, he declined to request anything special. Instead, he ate the same simple meal offered to every inmate that night from the standard prison menu. No indulgence, no statement, no extravagance, just silence and surrender. Shortly before the execution, prison chaplains entered his holding cell and offered spiritual counsel. Lopez thanked them politely, but remained calm and quiet, his eyes distant yet focused. Guards described him as cooperative, even peaceful. He made no last-minute requests, no dramatic gestures, and no visible signs of fear. For a man moments away from death, his composure was striking. At exactly 6 p.m., witnesses, including journalists, law enforcement representatives, and members of both families, were escorted into the small viewing area separated by thick glass. On the other side lay Daniel Lee Lopez, strapped to the gurney, his arms extended and 4 lines secured. His chest rose and fell in measured breaths as he turned his head toward the glass. In that moment, he looked not defiant, but resolved, a man who had made peace with his punishment. I would like to thank you. I hope this execution helps my family and also the victim's family. This was never meant to be, sure beyond my power. I can only walk the path before me and make the best of it. I'm sorry for putting y'all through this. I am sorry. I love you. I am ready. May we all go to heaven. Thank you, Warden Jones. At 6:31 p.m., the state of Texas pronounced Daniel Lee Lopez dead by lethal injection. He was 27 years old. Witnesses described the moment as solemn and quiet. No visible struggle, no hesitation. Just a deep exhale and stillness. For the first time in years, the man who had asked for death was finally at peace. Outside the prison walls, reporters broadcast the news live as the families of both men grieved in different ways. One mourning a hero taken too soon, the other closing the painful chapter of a son who had lost his way. And for the state of Texas, the case of Daniel Lee Lopez marked yet another execution in a long and controversial history, but one unlike most because this time the condemned man was the one who asked for it. As the final moments of this story fade into history, we are left with questions that reach beyond the walls of any prison. What does justice truly mean when a condemned man seeks out his own execution? Should the state honor an inmate's wish to die, even when mental illness and remorse might blur the line between acceptance and despair? And what about the people left behind, the families who must live with both the loss of the victim and the haunting truth of the offender's fate? In the case of Daniel Lee Lopez, the system carried out exactly what the law demanded. Yet, beneath the surface of legal closure lies a moral dilemma that continues to divide a nation. Was this execution an act of accountability or an assisted end for a man who no longer wanted to live? For the family of Lieutenant Stuart Alexander, the punishment brought a sense of justice, but it could never bring back the man who served his city with honor. For others, the case stands as a sobering reminder of how easily pain, regret, and the will to die can become intertwined in the machinery of justice. What do you think? Should the state uphold an inmate's wish for execution, or intervene when mental illness may cloud that choice? Was justice truly served for Lieutenant Stuart Alexander? Or does this story expose the fragile balance between law, mercy, and humanity? We want to hear from you. Tell us your thoughts in the comments below, and let's start a conversation about what justice means in a case like this. And if you found this story thought-provoking, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to Crime Report Network, where we bring you powerful, true stories of crime, justice, and redemption from across America. Each case is more than a headline. It's a glimpse into the human side of tragedy and the choices that shape our world.